stand up and share your voice along with anyone else. We are reading these all together. So if you want to have your voice tonight,
Mabel.
People of Solomon's Porch. Tonight we need faith, hope, and love. Loved by God without exception, and loving one another without condition. We welcome all here. Married, divorced, and single here. It's one community that neighbors here.
Conservative and liberal here.
We've all got gift here. Big and small here. There's room for us all here. Doubt and believe here. We all give and receive here. Whatever your race here, for all of us grace here. LGBTQ and straight here, there is no hate here. Whatever your pronoun here, everyone can here. With the love of God for each of us and all of us, we meet seeking to be a benefit and blessing for all the world. Amen. I'm glad to offer my welcome. I hope you got one from other people that are around too. Just a couple of things. You might notice that there's these big bins sitting around. You're going to hear about it at the announcement time, but I just want to put a special note on it. They're for the Crisis Nursery, which is an organization right up the road that we work with. And the Crisis Nursery helps people when they need a place of safety to bring their child. And they are in need of these bins, 4 of them. So we bought them, we're asking for you to pay for them, and then fill them up with things. So they're about $800 for those 4 bins. So we'd love to raise that by Easter, and then on Easter have a bunch of filled up bins and give over to the Crisis Nursery. One of the reasons that we meet on Sunday nights is to tell stories, to encourage one another, to meet each other, to learn, but also to share our lives in projects like that. So we're super glad you're here. We're talking about the leavings, the sendings, the crossings, the enterings, what in Bible language you call the Exodus. And all of us are leaving somewhere, going somewhere, crossing to somewhere, entering somewhere. So we're really glad you entered this room tonight and you're with us here. Victoria's going to lead us in a little description of how we can engage our lives in some different spaces around the room. This is time of prayer, so Victoria will have her way with us.
When we think about the theme of Exodus, a lot of times we focus on like what we're leaving or where we're going, and we sort of forget to think about the process or the journey, and that in and of itself can hold some extraordinary things, even if it's painful and difficult. So we invite you to think about aspects of your life where you might be crossing. Maybe you're in between from one place and another. Maybe you want to invite God to support you in that process and to ask God to help you to find what good there may be in that. So we have several places that you can engage using essential oils because you can carry a scent with you no matter where you are and where you're going. So the essential oils are back at this back table here, or up on the stage, and there's a couple of little sheets of paper that you can use to facilitate your process. So you have a few minutes, and then we'll say something all together at the end. So go ahead and make your way to an essential oil place now. sometimes crossing can feel aimless or like we're wandering, but there's a lot we can find in that as well. So I ask you to engage in saying this piece of liturgy with me. We're going to all read it together.
We find courage in wandering. When our feet won't stop walking and can't remember where we began, we find a future in wandering. We are lost in maze with no end in sight. We find our center in wandering. When we can't see the road through winds, sand, and tears, we find faith in wandering. When our minds take us thousands of miles forward, we find wisdom in wandering. When our destination is beyond exhaustion, we find battle in wandering. When hunger and thirst come with movement and change, we find nourishment in wandering. When the strangers around us become community, we find a home in wandering.
Okay, if you haven't done so already, you may make your way back to your place.
So the reading is John 6, 16 through 24. When evening came, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake. They got into a boat and were crossing the lake of Capernaum. It was already getting dark, and Jesus had to come to them. The water was getting rough because a strong wind was blowing. When the wind had driven them out for about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on water. He was approaching the boat, and they were afraid. He said to them, "I am. Don't be afraid." When they wanted to take him into the boat, they wanted to take him into the boat, and just then the boat reached the land where they had been headed.
Hey, my name is Carla, and I'm glad to add my welcome to Doug's and Victoria's. And I get to invite you into communion now. We do communion open house party style so that we can all commune together. Jesus shared bread and wine with his disciples as an act of sharing his physical and spiritual self. Christians have continued this tradition, sharing a meal as an embodied act of spiritual community and remembering. Different Christian communities have honored their own community traditions, embodying Christ in different ways, all with their own beauty, rituals, and wisdom. We invite you to share at this communion table in the way that feels right to you. Bring your traditions or experiences with you or leave them behind. You're fully welcome. To make space to bring your tradition with you, we do communion around the room in house party style. All can serve and all can eat. We gather around tables and chat or reflect. So you'll find communion scattered throughout the room on various tables. There are baskets with bread and gluten-free crackers and juice. There's also wine right here. You'll notice I positioned myself close to that. So feel free to get up and take and eat, and then we'll gather together at the end and say a little bit some stuff together off the screen, and then enjoy your time together. screens, we'll say this together, and I'm sure you're engaged in really fantastic conversations. Be sure you join us for dinner downstairs so you can continue those over, I think we're having chili. So come downstairs after for chili. So if you would, look at the screens. Together, we embody the way of Jesus.
Together, as many parts of one body, we partake of life's joys and sorrows. Together we eat bread, remembering that we offer our lives to one another in community. We drink together to remember that we are free from judgment to love. Together we embody love.
Oh, Checka, you want to come and tell us what the kids are up to today? Or Jamie, just likes to do that. Awesome.
All right, the kids are going to come with us in just a moment. The little ones will be in the playroom with Checka in the middle playroom here. And once again, parents, please gather your little ones when you are done in here and then bring them downstairs. The middles will be with Shelly and me, and we are going to be over the next couple of weeks talking about some stories of healing and the life that can come in unexpected places. And today we will be working with beets, doing some chopping, and then over the next number of weeks or months we'll be observing how life sprouts up when not expected. So all the children can now come out and meet in the gathering room. If you have a little one who doesn't feel comfortable showing up to be on their own, feel free to ask for them.
While we're making this transition, I have a couple of invitations for you to consider for this week. We have a lot happening. We have regular groups. You can go to our website, check those out. But then on this Friday, we have Intentional Community that meets every other week. There will be a link to that in our weekly email, and you can see what's happening. That goes from 5:30 to 8:30 with dinner and all ages fun. And then on Sunday, a week from tonight, after the gathering, I'm most excited about this. We're going to be watching Into the Spider-Verse here in this gathering space. So you can come to the gathering at 5 this Sunday. You can go down and grab your dinner quick and then come upstairs. The Into the Spider-Verse is great. There'll be in the weekly email, there'll be a couple of links to articles about the movie that you might want to read because Black Nerd Problems has some great articles about it. So that's it. For Easter, I think we've mentioned that that's coming in 3 weeks, and we'll have a sunrise gathering at Lake Harriet and also an afternoon gathering. So just kind of be mindful of that also. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything you want to do.
One of the things we like to do in these gatherings is allow people to share what they make, what they create, what they do. Russ and Pedro has been sharing some things this year.
Okay, so I have a show coming up this Saturday at Catherine Nash Gallery at the University of Minnesota. As a lot of you know, I've been working the last 3 years pretty heavily on my master's degree there, and it is time for my thesis show. It has been a long, arduous process. You know, most weeks are 60 to 80 hours a week, work a week, and it's been a really amazing experience. I got to go to Berlin on artist residencies both summers. I got to teach at the university all of this last year. I teach photography, and that's been a really wonderful experience. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about my work. The work that I'm showing for this show started with some research that I discovered when I was in Berlin 2 summers ago. And it's this French philosopher named Marc Auger, and he writes about this theory called non-place. And geographers talk about place as in space is this openness and possibility, and place is the particularities, and places where people are meant to gather and people come together. It has joining characteristics, and so there are these 2 kinds of way of being. And Auger, he postulates that there's this new place that people are existing in called non-place. It's not meant for openness, but it's not meant for gathering, and we pass through a lot of life. And so he talks about airports and highways and shopping malls, like this pass-through thing. So then I was thinking about that and making work around non-place and thinking about what does it mean to live in instability, what does it mean to be in this in-between as a state of mind. And so then I started thinking a little bit further though, like that ability to move is a privilege. Like as I was thinking about what was that thing we just read tonight about all the things that we get to wander? You know, all of the things that happen when we get to wander. Well, who gets to wander? People with privilege. Who gets stuck in the airport for days? People that are not let in other countries. The kids that are being held at the borders. Like, to be able to move and have movement is a privilege. And so, the work that I'm showing kind of talks about that discussion between waiting, between power, between agency, and who gets to have that and how and why. You want to go to the next slide? And so, like, I do this kind of unusual pairing. Sometimes they're an abstract image with a literal image, and like, you know, you have a beautiful landscape on the left. It looks like beautiful, lush farmland. But if you think about looking at the image, you're standing up on top of this hill, and you get to stand from this vantage point where you get to see everything. You get to have ownership of everything, and you get to see how the land is constructed. And now you see how the farmland is constructed, and the land is contoured, and somebody has controlled it. Not only controlled it, you know, colonized it. And so it begins to call up questions about who gets to own land and be on land and why, and who gets to be there looking at land. And I mean, the land is fallow, so it's waiting to be tilled the next year, it's waiting to be tilled for the following year, but it's also sitting there waiting, reminding us of our past, and reminding us of the control of the present. And this image on the right is an image from City Hall in Minneapolis. And it's this weird place that's like, it looks like a church pew, but it like has religious connotations and all this white marble, and it's sitting outside. You can't really tell it's sitting outside the city council chambers, but it is this place of power and decision, and you sit outside this space and you wait for whoever's on the inside to make those decisions. This pairing is another waiting, and formally they have an interesting relationship, right? The tangle of the branches on top and then the carpet on the bottom has that kind of same jagged relationship. But what you can't see in that image is, what's on that video screen is a Board of Regents meeting for the University of Minnesota, which is happening in the other room. And so you have these people sitting at this table overlooking the people in front of them, getting to make the decisions for the community around them. There's out the window to the right, you're at this high up vantage point again, looking over the land below you that you get to observe. And so it's this relationship between inside and outside, and the tangle of the branches, talking about the complicatedness of decision making and who and why. And in a lot of these images, there's an inside and an outside, and a belonging and a not belonging. And to belong inadvertently means that somebody doesn't belong. And so those are all of the questions that I'm thinking about in my images, and that the relationships as they're set up, that's the kind of conversation that I'm having. So, I hope you'll all come Saturday night, 6 to 9, Catherine Nash Gallery at the university. Thank you.
Thank you.
During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, lead my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added, and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed, and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast, because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. translation of the Lord's Prayer from Aramaic. O cosmic birth of all things in vibration, soften the ground of our being and carve out space within us where your presence can abide. Fill us with your creativity so that we may be empowered to bear the fruit of your mission. Let each of our actions bear fruit in accordance with our desire. Endow us with the wisdom to produce and share what each being needs to grow and flourish. Untie the tangled threads of destiny that bind us as we release others from the entanglement of past mistakes. Do not let us be seduced by that which would divert us from our true purpose, but illuminate the opportunities of the present moment. For you are the ground and the fruitful vision, the birth, power, and fulfillment, as all is gathered and made whole once again.
You might be keenly aware that Jesus didn't speak in English, of course, right? The Jews didn't speak in English. The Israelites didn't speak in English. The Greeks of the New Testament didn't speak in English. That many of us in the room, though, do. So we are going to put words up in English, and so someone's doing some translating. Those translations are often really good and super helpful. I will say I much appreciate that I don't only have to hear Jesus' teachings in a version of Aramaic. I'm glad that I can hear the stories of Exodus, not only in the original Hebrew, right? It's good. But we also know somebody's got their fingers on that all the time, right? Someone's doing that work. That's important and crucial work, but it's also someone's fingerprints are on it. Some people feel that because religion has to go through a cultural lens, it loses a little something. I don't know, I guess that could be true. It loses a little something. I like to think it gains a little something. It gains the us. It puts us in the game. It puts us in the midst of it, right? Whoever it is that translated the NIV version of the Lord's Prayer that you first read, that probably came from the Septuagint and then came into some sort of a Old English and then was probably found in some kind of a Greek text later and then retranslated back into the English, they got themselves in on the game. And when you read it and you heard the Lord's Prayer said as you first heard it, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, all of that, you're in on that thing too, right? The speed at which you say it, if you like to say our Father or our Mother or just our God or how you do it. And I think that religion's really great when it calls us into it. It's extremely helpful that it's not something that's happening out there that we observe, that it's not just happening from another person being applied to us, but we find ourselves up in it. I think that the teachings of our Christian religion, Christian faith, Christian traditions are almost always best that way. We've been saying that we're talking about the Exodus in these conversations, this idea that there's a leaving and that there's a sending, there's a crossing, there's an entering, there's an Exodus. As I mentioned last week, if you were talking with Rabbi Joseph, who's our very familiar rabbi from Temple Israel, used to be the rabbi at Temple Israel and is around here. He would tell you, or maybe you have some Jewish scholar friends or some other Jewish friends that adhere to the Jewish faith and tradition, they'll tell you that Exodus is a really big category. It holds a lot of things. Holds the readings that we read tonight out of the book of Exodus. It has the sense that the people after 400 years are freed and are now on their way, but it also has an idea that they're entering into a land. They had to cross through a water. There had to be establishment of a new leader. Like Exodus is a lot. So much so that we tend to not use that phrase all that often, to refer to our own stories. But I'd like to encourage you to consider over the next few weeks, especially as we think about Easter together, to think about Exodus in its big sense, in the sense of leaving or being sent, or what it is you're crossing. Maybe you're entering into something. I think it's fair enough to say that the entire narratives of the gospel, especially the Gospel of John, which is one that I've been spending a lot of time with lately, I'm going to take a couple minutes and talk about the story we read tonight that came out of the Gospel of John that you heard Jake read earlier. That that is really trying to tell a big Exodus story. It's a creation and Exodus story. It's a Genesis and Exodus story. It's a beginning and ascending, leaving, crossing, entering story. One of the reasons that it is so powerful and is written the way that it is and that it matches the storyline of the books of Genesis and Exodus is because fundamentally it's a human story. We're all in the midst of a starting. We're all in the midst of ascending. We're all crossing somewhere. This is something that we're all up to and that we're all doing. And I've been saying this the last couple of weeks. I'll just make it quick again. I think it's really helpful to think about Jesus as a master teacher and to take his words as that of a master teacher, that not only is his life something of consequence and meaning and action, but so are his teachings. And I encourage us tonight to consider these, even though the teaching tonight's going to come from one of Jesus' actions. That Jesus has a particular way of humanity for humanity to live, and that Jesus as the Son of God is trying to represent the family metaphor of Jesus as the brother of all, so that we're all children in the same family of God, and that what Jesus is up to, we ought to be up to. All right, so that takes us into a bit into the story tonight. Just to interfere a bit, if you looked at the story of Exodus and you looked at the story of Jesus, you would notice that in both the Exodus story and the Jesus story, you have a chosen leader, Moses in the Exodus story, Jesus in the gospel stories. You have a provision of food happening. There it's the manna that gets delivered. In Exodus, it's the manna that gets delivered. You might know that in the Jesus story, just before he does this thing we're going to look at tonight, he feeds thousands of people out on a hillside. It's a retelling of a manna story. All of us are being led and leading. All of us are providing food in some way. There's some kind of a mountain trek that goes on. For Moses, he goes up on the mountain and gets the word. For Jesus, he goes up on the mountain and prays. There's a water event of some kind in Exodus. You know what that one is. They cross the sea, and the sea comes crashing down on some and frees some others. And there's a water event. And Jesus is presented as this new Moses in a new creation story. Okay, so hold on to that in your mind and be reminded of the story that Jake read. Would somebody in the room be willing to be our reader again of this, just to sort of recap your mind? You've heard a lot of things tonight already, but would you be comfortable, somebody, being our reader of this whole slide?
When evening came, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake. They got into a boat and were crossing the lake into Capernaum. It was already getting dark and Jesus hadn't come to them yet. The water was getting rough because a strong wind was blowing. When the wind had driven them out for about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on water. He was approaching the boat and they were afraid. He said to them, "I am. Don't be afraid." Then they went to take him into the boat, and just then the boat reached the land where they had been headed.
All right, this is often referred to as the Jesus walking on water miracle, right? It's I've spent a lot of time looking at this because I've been writing a book about the Gospel of John, and this is such a curious story. One of the things that happens in almost all the other miracles of Jesus, there's 7 of them in the Gospel of John, 6 of them, somebody's a beneficiary, except this one of the 7. Like, who gets the upside on this thing, right? Jesus walks on water. Who's that good for? Who benefits from this one? At first reading, it's super possible to read this story and just be like, this is like if you went to seminary or something and you had to write a paper on the Gospels and the miracles, you'd put this in the category of the Gospels that involve elements, as opposed to the healing gospel or the miracles that involve elements, or the healing miracles and the others. It's really easy to think there's no beneficiaries in this story. Guys are out on a boat. They are actually going from one side of the lake, where Jerusalem is, to another side of the lake. It's going to become important in a minute when you start to see that what the Gospel of John writers are doing is giving us a new Exodus story where there's a water event. But in this case, rather than going from Egypt and crossing into the Promised Land with Jerusalem, they start in Jerusalem and cross over to Capernaum. So it's a reverse story. Instead of the waters separating, Jesus goes on top of the waters. Instead of all the people being in panic that what's behind them is their death and their fear, the Egyptians chasing them, in this story, the death and fear and dread is within them. The beneficiaries in this story are the people in the boat, I think the way the gospel writers want us in our time, if they ever imagined that people, 2,000 years later would be sitting in a room chatting about all of this, but at least the readers of their day, what they wanted them to capture was the notion of Exodus as a happening that happens inside of us as much as it happens outside of us. Okay, so this is a water story. That's important partly because in the first century, water, lakes, rivers were thought about as metaphors, as narratives, as places that would describe chaos, the wind blowing on the waters, the troubling of the waters. It represented danger. You would be brought down to the bottom of the sea, and could the Lord ever find you in the bottom of the sea? It was basically dread and destruction. So in the first century, water, when it would show up in a narrative or in a story, was seen as chaos, dread, danger, destruction narratives. This is part of the reason that in the Exodus, because in that period of time as well, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years earlier, the early Mesopotamian cultures also thought about water in this way. And you can see it happening that way. In fact, you spend a little time reading any of that ancient literature about waters, and it almost always is somehow calming dread or causing dread. Something's got to get stirred up in the waters, or the waters have to be calmed down. You might know the beginning of the Genesis narrative, that there was chaos on the waters, and then the Lord spoke and calmed the waters and separated the earth from the land and brought order because there was chaos. Okay, this is all that kind of thing. I think what's happening in this narrative, and the reason that it carries over, I think has a lot to do with any of us in our ways and places, is because it gives us this really unique invitation to look at our own lakes that we're floating on, that we're trying to figure out, how are we going to calm the seas? So this is a water story. Hold on to that idea for a minute. The notion of I am was the big statement that Moses, if you were around last week or you heard the reading this week, Moses says to God, well, who's ever going to listen to me? And he says, well, just tell them that I've sent you. He says, well, if I tell them you sent me, who do I say sent? He says, I am, right? This is the whole narrative of all this. God doesn't get a name in the Old Testament. The reason God doesn't get a name in the Old Testament is because you name things that you possess. You name your headphones in your Bluetooth settings. You name your animal. In fact, a lot of families wait until the child is born, until they look at the child and say, what name does the child tell us they should be called, so I don't think of them as a possession, right? You might name an animal. You might name a car. You might name a tree. Naming has something to do with possessing. That's in the Genesis story as well, right? So God in the Old Testament never gets a name because no one can own God. So God is above ownership. God is above a thing. God is the basis of all things, called the great I am. In that little story that we heard, what is the thing that Jesus says when he walks on the water, right? They're terrified, and then he says, I am, do not be afraid. He's now hearkening to a narrative about God. He's now hearkening to a narrative about the waters. He's now hearkening to a narrative about crossings, about exoduses, about chaos, about danger, about dread, all of this. So then this is a bit about Moses saying, what is God's name? What am I supposed to say to them? Say, I am who I am. Says to the Israelites, I am has sent me. Right, and that's that bit out of Exodus 13. All right, here's a way of thinking about this story that we just read of Jesus. When evening came, it was already dark. When evening came, it was getting dark. If you're a great storyteller, you can take a paragraph and tell an entire story. John and I are big fans of the show Billions. And if you watch Billions, you know that like in the opening scenes of Billions, they will take like 3 minutes worth of, 4 seasons and pack you right into a story. They're master storytellers. When evening came, it was already getting dark. I think the gospel writers want their people then, and I think it's positive for our people now, to stop and say, okay, this is a story about people, maybe people like us, whether it's happening to you now or it's going to happen to you in the future, who can feel like night is coming and it's starting to get dark. That starts to conjure up, you're running out of time.
Now what? Have you ever been lost? Have you ever been lost at night? Have you ever been really, really hungry and starting to shake? The idea that it's getting dark and trouble's brewing, they're on the water. The waters represent chaos and danger and dread and destruction. They're trying to get across the water, and it's becoming night, and it's already starting to get dark. So this starts to churn you up. Now, if in your life right now you can't comprehend a place or a time or an avenue by which you have felt darkness setting in, you have felt like you're running out of time, you felt like, maybe it's not going to go. That hasn't happened to you in a business, hasn't happened to you in your church, hasn't happened to you in a relationship, hasn't happened to you in your feelings about yourself, hasn't happened to you in your health. This story might lay a little flat. But if you do know that story, this thing starts to rise. All right, so not only is it getting dark. By the way, I wrote about that, a chapter of this book that I just finished on this, and I found this really interesting statistic that I just keep trying to find a way to tell people, including you right now. They did a study of parole boards and how often parole boards granted parole, and they would break the day into 4 parts: the morning before 10 a.m., 10 a.m. to noon, after lunch 1:30 till 3, and then 3 o'clock until 5 o'clock. In the 1:30 until 3, the time after lunch, parole boards grant paroles 60% of the time. 60. In the slot from 10:30 until noon, they grant parole 0% of the time. The reason is people are hungry on the parole boards. They believe that when people start to get hungry, they start to become more agitated, they start to become more stingy, they start to think differently, and there's this massive difference in the same parole board of who gets parole before lunch and who gets parole directly after lunch. When it's getting late and getting dark, and Jesus hasn't come yet. In other words, you're running out of options. Who's the band that sang Running on Empty? Jackson Brown? Jackson Brown? Thank you. Okay, then, the water was getting rough because the winds were blowing strong. Storyline. It's getting late, it's getting dark, solution hasn't come yet, and it's getting worse. Then they see Jesus walking on the water. And in the storyline, what do they want to do? Help Jesus, right? The thing they try to do is want to bring him into the boat. They try to persuade him into the boat. Doesn't come in the boat. And just about that time, he says, I am, don't be afraid, change the narrative. And right then, they get to the other side. Evening came, the disciples went down the lake. They got in a boat, they were crossing to Capernaum, it had already begun to get dark, and Jesus hadn't come yet. Now you can fill that in. Maybe somebody could already do it. Is there anybody in the room right now who knows a situation, maybe happening in your own life or something else, that you could start with a different story yet? You could say your own version of, you were on an enterprise, you were making your move, it started to get dark, and the solutions hadn't come yet. Does anybody have something like that going in them, in their life, in their happening? Anything they could reflect on right now?
Yep. I don't
Yep.
have my May rent. I'm looking for work still, and it's starting to get tight on my bumper.
Here we go. Here's Bernie. It's happening again.
I got one done too.
Yep.
A week and a half ago, I told my principal my school wasn't coming back next year because I've been kind of miserable, but I don't have anything really lined up. So I was like,
It's getting dark.
it's getting dark, but I don't know.
Yep. Anybody else? Anybody have a thing in their life where they feel like the waters are getting rough and the wind is starting to blow and it's starting to drive you 3 or 4 miles away from where you thought you were going? Your solutions making things worse, not better? Anybody got one of those? Starts to get a little embarrassing at some point, doesn't it? I mean, who wants to say that one? He's approaching the boat, and they were afraid. I want to take him in the boat. Just then, the boat reached where they wanted to go. This is a story of fear, which we all know. It's a story of superstition. One of the other versions of the Gospels tell this story, and you might remember what the people in the boat say. You remember? It's a ghost. How's he walking on water? Why is he walking on water? Is the water the dark? Is the water the deep? Is the water all these other things? The curious thing is, I'll just steal the punchline. The miracle here isn't Jesus walks on water. The miracle here is that people make it to the other side. The miracle of the Exodus is that the people made it to the other side. That the fear, the superstition, and the anxiety can become replaced with a high sense of empathy, with a different sense of emotional maturity, and with some kind of a sense of well-being. This is the story. Exodus always requires some kind of transformation. An exodus in your personal life, in a collective life, in a nation. I mean, if this nation has been trying to live an exodus from a whole series of harmful actions that it has performed on itself and others around the world for 280 years, right? Narratives of exodus, whether it's a national narrative, a personal narrative, a corporate narrative, a church narrative, is always going to be some kind of just a transformation. You don't just go from here to there. I don't want to brag about the work you do walking in the woods, but this nice gentleman over here has some flyers right there. He takes people. Maybe you heard that in Japan, people will spend 3 hours in the woods in guided meditations in woods, and it changes their lives. He's a trainer in that. I'm guessing that what you do when you take people in the woods, as a stranger sitting here, is you help people deal with fear, superstition, and anxieties. I don't put words in your mouth, but that can transition into empathy and into emotional maturity and to well-being. If it's not an exodus, if all you do is get to the other side, if all you do is grit and make it through it, if all you do is get enough money for rent, if all you do is land one more job, then you just made it. Right? But there's no freedom. For the nation of Israel, the idea is that there's freedom. So Shelly and I were having this conversation because she was doing something with the kids. Shelly's the woman I'm married to. And we were talking about some stories that she wanted to tell. And we started talking about Jesus raising Lazarus. Do you know that story? And then we were talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And look, this happens all the time. But the Lazarus story is not a resurrection story. The Lazarus story is where this person dies and then Jesus comes and 3-4 days later yells in the tomb, says, Lazarus, come out. Lazarus comes out. That's not a resurrection story. That's a resuscitation story. Lazarus in the storyline is going to die again and goes home after that coming out and makes lunch, right? That's not a resurrection. A resurrection requires transformation. The Jesus story is a resurrection story. So if you don't want to believe a resurrection story or the Lazarus story, you get to not believe two things. If you like to believe one and not the other, fair enough. A resuscitation story leaves the person essentially in the condition they were always in. You got pulled back from the brink. A resurrection story is a transformation story. Don't touch me, you can't hold on to me, Jesus says. Mary doesn't recognize him. He shows up in rooms where he isn't. He ascends into the heavens. He transitions, transforms. Exodus stories are not pull back from the brink stories. Exodus stories are moving through stories. Exodus stories are moving into greater empathy and emotional well-being and emotional maturity. So the questions for almost all of us is, you're on that boat, the thing is shaken, the wind is blowing, we have choices. Just to get to the other side or to consider it an exodus? Was it a leaving? Was it ascending? Was it a crossing? Did you go somewhere? Now that's a story I know a lot of people in this room know really well, right? Lots of people have faced it. Some people are facing it right now. What does it mean in your own life, in your own heart, in your own place, in your own work, in your own family, to be working into some kind of an Exodus story and not just some kind of a crossing story? Do not be afraid. This was the miraculous event. The removal of fear and getting to the place where you're headed, even in the midst of the storms you can't control, and still crossing to the other side. Sometimes our crossing involves moving from one place to another. At other times, it means opening our hearts to the needs and struggles of others, crossing into their world for their benefit and for ours. We often need to overcome fear in our relationships with ourselves, engaging with our own scary memories and histories to move our own lives forward. That's what makes it an exodus. This is one of the reasons why death is always referred to as this great exodus. Have you seen the movie Free Solo, where they document a man in 2017 climbing El Capitan, this 4,000-foot sheer cliff, without a rope? I watched it on the airplane today. I was flying back, and the plane is shaking, and I've just barely ever had a panic attack, and I was just sweating, and it was horrible. It was a horrible, horrible experience. What's he doing? Yeah, seriously, go home and watch it. It's the scariest thing. Okay. What's going on there is that fear is a really good thing. You should not hand and toe climb El Capitan. It's just crazy. But he does. It's an Exodus movie. It's unbelievable. All right, let's chat a bit. What do you think about Exoduses? What do you think about this story? What are you thinking about other things right now? We've got a couple of minutes for that. Anybody?
I think it's interesting that Jesus didn't say, hey, the shore's right there, guys. You're almost there. He said, stop and be with me right now. You can actually look at what you need to do, just like the guy in Free Solo. He can't have fear. If he has fear, he dies.
Yeah.
So he has to be present to the next thing
Yeah.
that's happening right now.
Nice.
So I found that interesting.
Sorry, I like that. Somebody, my friend, I think it was Randy from Michigan, wrote on Facebook. I'm not sure I buy this, but I get what he was getting at. He said, my experience has been that when I'm feeling depression, it's because I'm looking backward. When I'm feeling anxiety, it's because I'm looking forward. When I'm experiencing peace, it's because I'm living in the right now. So, something like that. He said it maybe a little better than that, but it was something like that.
To create safety.
Yes. Yeah.
I think what's hard is that an exodus is almost rarely chosen.
Yes.
Like this Free Solo guy, he chose to do that, and some people choose to do like super scary things, or like I think missionaries are people who leave home to help others. But like most exoduses, we do because we're forced to, not because we choose to.
Yeah.
So then that's kind of why it's scary, anxious, frightening.
Totally.
I think too, like a part of me believes all these pretty profound people throughout our history that caused a lot of change and fought for, great things, I often don't think of them being afraid, and I think they were.
Yeah.
And I think that they also were Dad, I'm going to do this because someone needs to do this, So, part of me really thinks, I always love the way you express it, and you're a teacher to me, and I appreciate that though, because when I heard you talking about, the resurrection thing, that blew my mind, the difference with resuscitation and resurrection, and I related it to my own redemption.
Yeah.
Because in my life I've tried to be, a better person and fully engage with my world and with people and right? But I've also noticed myself being really stagnant and judgmental of myself.
Yeah.
And kind of withholding myself from being able to plunge fully into that too. And so you're kind of speaking to me in a personal way.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I have a connection.
Yeah.
A lot of you here know me, and I've been around a long time, and some of you don't. So I'm coming up on 2 years where I basically got pulled back from the absolute brink, where I was doing a lot of drugs and just in a really bad place. And there had been moments where I had been pulled back, but I didn't change, right? And what was the first word you used? Resurrection and the first one.
Resuscitation.
Resuscitation. I was resuscitated for like 8 years. I would go to a treatment, I'd be fine, I'd be sober, whatever. But then about 2 years ago, I went through like almost a resurrection. And like, I would say it has been a transformation. It has been a complete and utter transformation.
Yeah.
I've lost 75 pounds, I've been sober, I've started working again. I have the self-confidence to say, no, this job is not what I want to be doing. I want to do something else. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I just really resonate with what you've been saying today.
Yeah. You have transformed.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that. Yeah. And almost always these exoduses require something that feels like or might actually mean death. Death of a relationship sometimes, death of a dream, death of a passion, death of a person. Transformations and exoduses they're not trivial matters. This is one of the things we were trying to talk about, because the kids, when they go, they want to integrate some of this stuff in, and I'm like this curmudgeon-y old guy that's like, the problem is these are not kid stories. Like Jesus walking on the water, or the resurrection, or the resuscitation of Lazarus, or any of the, like, these are not stories to ask you to become more simple. These are master stories told to cause you to become more mature. Like, it's really hard for kids to get this stuff. So I have all the empathy in the world for the people that are trying to make sense out of this for kids, or any of you that still have them around. Like, all the best to you. It's really hard to do, because this is really serious business. This is like real adulting stuff. I know there's versions of all this Christian stuff and all the miracle stories and all this, that one version is to become childlike or childish. I don't think that's what they're intended for. I think they're intended to bring you childlike, not in childish ways, but in the sense that you're going to now start to grow into adulthood. Childlike, so that you start to grow. So that growth, transformation, all that becomes part of it. And all right, any last comments? Anybody? Well, we've rearranged the order, you might know, on these few weeks. We're doing these 3 and 4 week experiments, and these weeks we're doing music without lyrics. So like it's background and some of that. So we're trying different styles of music and all. And we've rearranged some things. So this is now how we're ending this gathering. We're going to stand up in a minute and say this little blessing to each other. And Sarah's going to music us, I think, on the piano. Will you? At least on the way out. And that's how we're going to end. So if you've been following the last couple of weeks, every few weeks we make some adjustments to this. And I'll just remind you that we're also going to meet downstairs if you want to have dinner together. It is chili and cornbread, but it's different chili and different cornbread. So if you've been around the last couple of weeks and you're looking for something different, there is a dinner waiting for you, and lots of people to talk to that are in other parts of the building right now that maybe aren't in this room. So, but you're welcome to hang out up here or go down there as well. So if nobody else has anything, I'll invite you to stand up and grab a hand, and we'll say a blessing to and for each other. Somebody like to start us?
Peace of Christ with you. May you find peace. May you make peace. May you give peace. May peace never leave